Good morning, everyone. You may have heard of Narcissus. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was distinguished for his beauty. A prophet told Narcissus' mother that his son would live a long life provided he never recognized himself. Sadly, Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection in the waters of a spring. And that was the beginning of the end for him. The flower that bears his name sprang up where he died. These days, the term narcissism is used to describe someone who has an excessive amount of self-esteem or who admires themselves too much. A couple of months ago, we started a sermon series on hair and hairy people in the Bible. We heard about Esau, Samson, and Samuel. Then we took a few weeks' break to focus on other things. Today, we return to our hair series by looking at Absalom, the third son of King David. Absalom was a narcissist. He fancied himself a little too much. For those who are familiar with the Marvel Universe, Samson is like the Hulk, Samuel is like a hairy vision, and Absalom is like Loki. In case you don't know, Loki is a prince of Asgard and the brother of Thor. Loki is charming, good-looking, and intelligent, but also a master manipulator and a deceiver. Wherever he goes, destruction and grief follow. Absalom, like Loki, is vain and narcissistic, always looking for a way to promote himself. This is how 2 Samuel chapter 14 describes Absalom. There was no one in Israel as famous for his good looks as Absalom. He had no defect from head to toe. His hair was very thick, and he had to cut it once a year when it grew too long and too heavy. It would weigh about 5 pounds according to the royal standard of weights. I don't know anyone who goes to the trouble of weighing their hair, but apparently Absalom did. Please turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 15. Though Absalom's story starts in 2 Samuel 13, we are picking up the narrative from chapter 15, where Absalom plots to steal the throne from his father, David. From chapter 15, verse 1, we read, After this, Absalom provided a chariot and horses for himself, and an escort of 50 men. He would get up early and go and stand by the road at the city gate. Whenever someone came there with a dispute that he wanted the king to settle, Absalom would call him over and ask him where he was from. And after the man had told him what tribe he was from, Absalom would say, Look, the law is on your side, but there is no representative of the king to hear your case. And he would add, How I wish I were a judge. Then anyone who had a dispute or a claim could come to me, and I would give them justice. When the man would approach Absalom to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom did this with every Israelite who came to the king for judgment, and so he won their loyalty. May the Spirit of Jesus illuminate God's word for us. This passage gives us a picture of Absalom's character. Absalom fancies himself as king. Even though he is next in line to inherit the throne anyway, Absalom is not willing to wait for his father to die. Like the prodigal son in Jesus' parable, Absalom wants his inheritance now. Not only does Absalom dishonor his father in the worst possible way, he fails to consider God in this situation. He can't. His ego has left no room for God. In ancient Israel, it was the king's job to dispense justice and settle disputes. Was King David doing this adequately? Some people did not think so. Absalom used this to his advantage, offering himself as an alternative candidate for king. They say in politics, perception is reality. Absalom goes out of his way to cultivate a favourable perception of himself at the expense of his father. Absalom implies that David is failing in his administration of justice. He sympathizes with the people without actually doing anything constructive to help them. It is all smoke and mirrors. Absalom is completely beguiled by his own image. He works hard at stealing the people's hearts for 4 years. Then, using the cloak of worship to hide his true motives, Absalom asks David's permission to go to Hebron to make some sacrifices. Offering sacrifices is supposed to be about expressing love for God. But Absalom is in love with himself. God is not on his radar. On his way to Hebron, Absalom sends messengers throughout the towns of Israel to proclaim he is king. Then Absalom sends for Ahithophel, one of the king's advisors. Up to that point, Ahithophel had served David. He was highly regarded for his wise advice. But Ahithophel switched allegiances and backed Absalom. When King David learned that public perception was against him and the loyalty of the people was with Absalom, David left the palace in Jerusalem with his family and his officials. Verse 30 of 2 Samuel 15 says that David went up the Mount of Olives weeping. He was barefoot and had his head covered as a sign of grief. This reminds us of Jesus on the Mount of Olives, weeping and praying in great anguish the night of his betrayal and arrest. But while David was leaving Jerusalem to save his life, Jesus came to Jerusalem to die. It is a strange thing. When life is relatively easy for David, he tends to make poor choices and show a lack of moral fibre. It was when he was comfortably installed in his palace that David committed adultery with Bathsheba and plotted to have Uriah killed in battle. But when life is tough and David is forced out of his comfort zone and into the wilderness, this seems to bring the best out of him. Some of David's best poetry was written when he was on the run, first from King Saul and then later from his son Absalom. It is thought that David wrote Psalm 63 while in the wilderness because of Absalom. In verse 1 of Psalm 63, David says, "O God, you are my God, and I long for you. My whole being desires you. Like a dry, worn-out, and waterless land, my soul is thirsty for you." Unlike Absalom, who was proud and yearned for power and applause, David longs for the Lord his God. Likewise, David was at his most gracious when people were treating him with gross injustice, like a light that shines brightest when the night is darkest. So too, David's goodness is most evident when the odds are stacked against him. As David leaves Jerusalem, grief-stricken, he has a series of encounters with various individuals, and each encounter reveals David's generosity of spirit, his wisdom, and his faith in God. David's first conversation is with a man named Ittai. Ittai is a foreigner, a Gentile refugee who has only just found his place in the land of Israel. Unlike Absalom, who is completely absorbed with himself, David thinks of others. In particular, David considers for Ittai's well-being. David does not want Ittai to become a refugee all over again, so he gives Ittai the option of leaving to save his own skin. But Ittai binds himself to David with an oath, saying, "Your Majesty, I swear to you in the Lord's name that I will always go with you wherever you go, even if it means death." We are reminded of Ruth, the Moabite, who pledged her loyalty, her hesed, to Naomi. It is somewhat ironic that foreigners in the Bible often have more faith in the God of Israel and his chosen king than the Lord's own people do. We are mindful of the Roman centurion, of whom Jesus said, "I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel." The next encounter David has is with the priests, Zadok and Abiathar. They are loyal to David and have brought the covenant box with them in support of David. The covenant box was a symbol of God's presence. But David says to them, "Take the covenant box back to the city. If the Lord is pleased with me, someday he will let me come back to see it and the place where it stays. But if he isn't pleased with me, well then, let him do to me what he wishes." Again, we see the contrast between David and Absalom here. Absalom is quite prepared to use the cloak of religion to mask his true intent and make himself look good in the eyes of others. But David will not misuse God in that way. David is well aware that he is not perfect, and he makes no pretense of it. David knows that God withdrew divine support for King Saul after Saul disobeyed the Lord. David is perhaps conscious of his failing with Bathsheba and does not presume upon God's grace. David has the faith to let God be God. David also has the faith to believe that God is not a prisoner of the covenant box. God is more than able to be present with David in the wilderness, with or without a religious artifact. This is not to imply that David's trust equates to mindless resignation. David is not being fatalistic. He's not throwing the dice and letting luck decide. David sends the priests back to Jerusalem, asking them to be his informers. So there is strategy in sending Zadok and Abiathar back with the covenant box. There's a saying which is attributed to Oliver Cromwell: "Trust in God and keep your powder dry." The powder here is gunpowder. Trusting in God does not mean folding your hands and doing nothing. Trusting God goes hand in hand with being prepared. David trusts in God and keeps his powder dry. David makes sure he is prepared. In Matthew 10, verse 16, Jesus said to his disciples, "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves." We see David's wisdom and innocence in the request he makes of Hashai. Hashai is a royal advisor similar to Ahithophel, except Hashai is loyal to David. The king tells Hashai to go to Absalom and pretend he has defected. Once Hashai has gained Absalom's confidence, he is to muddy the waters and mislead Absalom with advice that will give David an advantage. Hashai returns to Jerusalem just as Absalom is arriving to make himself king. Hashai proves to be as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. Not everyone was so friendly to David, though. After David has travelled a bit further toward the Jordan River, he meets one of Saul's relatives, a man named Shimei. When Shimei sees David, he curses the king and starts throwing stones at him. Shimei criticizes David, saying, "You took Saul's kingdom, and now the Lord is punishing you for murdering so many of Saul's family. The Lord has given the kingdom to your son Absalom, and you are ruined, you murderer." In actual fact, David did not murder Saul's family, and he did not take Saul's kingdom. God chose David to replace Saul as king. And even though David had more than one opportunity to kill Saul, David refused to lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. Although Shimei is misinformed of the details, his words do strike a chord of truth. David did effectively arrange for Bathsheba's husband Uriah to be murdered. David is not guilty of crimes against Saul's family, but he does have blood on his hands, and he knows it. Some of David's men wanted to cut Shimei's head off, but David would not let them. David said to his men, "My own son is trying to kill me, so why should you be surprised at this Benjaminite? The Lord told him to curse, so leave him alone and let him do it. Perhaps the Lord will notice my misery and give me some blessings to take the place of this curse." Once again, we see David's wisdom and faith revealed under extreme pressure. David is theological in his response, and this helps him to keep his perspective. "My own son is trying to kill me," he says. That's the more important issue to deal with here. Shimei is the least of my worries at the moment. David remembers the sovereignty of God. David believes that ultimately God is in control, not Shimei. Perhaps Shimei is doing God's work. If that is the case, then David cannot argue with God. David knows he is a murderer and on some level recognizes he deserves the criticism, even if Shimei has the details wrong. David believes that God is both just and merciful. To the extent that Shimei is too heavy-handed in his abuse of David, the Lord can make that right by blessing David. David shows incredible trust in the goodness of God here. David's response to Shimei is wise. If he were to kill Shimei, it would only prove Shimei's point. By showing mercy to Shimei, David provides evidence that Shimei has no case. In his poem, The Divided World, Owen Marshall writes this wonderfully witty line. The world is divided between those who would try themselves and those who seek a less corrupt judge. The point is, we should not judge ourselves because we have an inherent bias. We cannot be relied upon to give a fair verdict about ourselves. Absalom judged himself to be a better king than his father. David refused to judge himself. David left the matter in God's hands, for God knows better and is completely fair in his judgments. As it turned out, God vindicated David, and afterwards Shimei apologized to David. You know, sometimes people make criticisms of us, and it hurts, especially if what they're saying is not all that accurate. No one enjoys being misunderstood or misrepresented. In that situation, we need to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. The temptation is to react in the heat of the moment. We do well to take some time to consider our response. Maybe God is trying to say something to us through that person. What is the kernel of truth in what they are saying? And what is the husk that we can discard? Perhaps like David, the wisest thing is to say nothing. Don't major on the minors and leave the matter in God's hands. Or maybe it's better, both for your own soul and for the other person, to speak your truth and put their ignorance to the sword of reason and fact. So far we have heard about Absalom's narcissistic plot and David's wise retreat. Also woven through this narrative is the Lord's providential hand. God is at work to achieve his purpose, quietly and unobtrusively through human beings. The war with Absalom is won as much behind the scenes as it is on the battlefield. When Absalom entered Jerusalem to take David's throne, Hashais, David's double agent, greeted Absalom with the words, "Long live the king." This is a wonderfully ambiguous greeting. Who is Hashais referring to as king? Is it David or Absalom? We, the reader, know that Hashais is backing David as king, but Absalom is vain enough to assume that Hashais is referring to him as king. Hashais is as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. When Absalom questions Hashai's loyalty, Hashai responds with another ambiguous remark. I am on the side of the one chosen by the Lord. Absalom's ego does not allow him to imagine that God would choose anyone else to be king but Absalom himself. Absalom thinks he is God's gift. Not long after Absalom has made himself at home in David's palace, Ahithophel, the wise advisor who turned against David, proposed a way ahead for Absalom. From verse 1 of chapter 17, we hear Ahithophel's plan. Let me choose 12,000 men, and tonight I will set out after David. I will attack him while he is tired and discouraged. He will be frightened, and all his men will run away. I will kill only the king, and then bring back all his men to you, like a bride returning to her husband. You want to kill only one man. The rest of the people will be safe. From a strategic point of view, this was actually really good advice. It is full of common sense, and would probably have worked, except for the Lord's providential hand. God had not chosen Absalom to be king. God was still with David. The Lord used Hashai, David's plant, to throw a spanner in the works. It appears that God robbed Absalom of common sense in this moment, so that Absalom asked Hashai for a second opinion. Hashai, who was really there to help David, answered, "The advice Ahithophel gave you this time is no good. You know that your father David and his men are hard fighters, and that they are as fierce as a mother bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is an experienced soldier and does not stay with his men at night. Right now he is probably hiding in a cave or some other place. As soon as David attacks your men, whoever hears about it will say that your men have been defeated. Then even the bravest men, as fearless as lions, will be afraid, because everyone in Israel knows that your father is a great soldier and that his men are hard fighters. My advice is that you bring all the Israelites together from one end of the country to the other, as many as the grains of sand on the seashore, and that you lead them personally in battle. We will find David wherever he is and attack him before he knows what's happening. Neither he nor any of his men will survive. If he retreats into a city, our people will all bring ropes and just pull the city into the valley below. Not a single stone will be left there on top of the hill." Hashai's plan is not as good as Ahithophel's clever strategy. Hashai's plan buys David time to get organised, and it puts Absalom in danger. The grandness and glory of Hashai's plan appeals to Absalom's ego, so that Absalom overlooks the practical realities involved. God makes sure Absalom swallows the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Once Absalom decides to go with Hashai's plan of attack, the priests who are loyal to David get word to their king in the wilderness, who then organises his troops in anticipation of Absalom's onslaught. From verse 6 of chapter 18, we read what happened. David's army went out into the countryside and fought the Israelites in Ephraim forest. The Israelites were defeated by David's army, and it was a terrible defeat, with 20,000 men killed that day. The fighting spread over the countryside, and more men died in the forest than were killed in battle. David's men were outnumbered, and yet they still won. Those of you who are fans of The Lord of the Rings may remember how the trees of the forest fought with the hobbits against the orcs. Verse 8 tells us more men died in the forest than were killed in battle. Even the forest was on David's side. This is another sign of the Lord's providential hand. This civil war in Israel was such a tragedy. It did not need to happen, and probably would never have happened except for Absalom's narcissism. Nevertheless, God is sovereign. Yes, he gives human beings a certain amount of freedom, but that freedom always has its limits. God won't let things get too out of control. The hand of the Lord made sure Absalom did not get away with the havoc he had caused. Verse 9 of 2 Samuel 18, we read, "Suddenly Absalom met some of David's men. Absalom was riding a mule, and as it went under a large oak tree, Absalom's head got caught in the branches. The mule ran on, and Absalom was left hanging in midair." How ironic is that? Absalom's long, beautiful hair got him tangled in the branches of a tree, so that he was held in limbo between heaven and earth. It must have been painful and terrifying for him to be held there powerless like that. Walter Brueggemann puts it like this: Absalom is suspended between life and death, between the sentence of a rebel and the value of a son, between the severity of the king and the yearning of a father. David did not want his son harmed. As a parent, you are never so vulnerable as with your kids. But when Joab, one of David's generals, heard about it, he killed Absalom and buried him in the forest. If we want to find some redemption in this story, we have to look to the gospel of Jesus. I don't imagine that any of you are quite as bad as Absalom, but that is only by the grace of God and a lack of opportunity. Everyone has at least a bit of Absalom in them. You might not think you do, but neither did Absalom. The truth is, each of us has rebelled against God's chosen king, against Jesus. Each of us has taken matters into our own hands and tried to usurp God's authority in our lives. Each of us in this world is suspended between eternal life and death. Each of us deserves the sentence of a traitor, and yet we are valued as God's sons and daughters. The gospel tells us that Jesus, God's chosen king, died on a cross in our place, suspended between heaven and earth. And nailed to that cross was Absalom's narcissism and ours. The good news is that through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection, we are set free from the tyranny of pride and the futility of vanity. We're set free to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. May God satisfy the longing of your soul with His presence.